I stood frozen in the grand ballroom of the Ocean View Country Club, watching my husband of 50 years wrap his arm around a woman half my age as he spoke into the microphone with a confidence that made my blood turn to ice. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Victoria, my real soulmate, the woman who's shown me what true love actually feels like. The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor as 200 of our closest friends and family members erupted into shocked murmurs, their faces a blur of confusion and horror that mirrored the devastation now consuming my entire world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The golden anniversary party I'd spent 6 months meticulously planning had just become the stage for the most public humiliation of my life. Every detail of this evening had been carefully orchestrated to celebrate 5 decades of what I believed was a loving marriage. The ice sculptures shaped like swans, the same flowers from our wedding bouquet cascading from every centerpiece. The slideshow of our life together projected on the wall behind the head table. All of it now felt like elaborate props in a cruel theater performance where I was the unwitting star of my own destruction. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, that's who I'd been for 72 years. Maggie to my friends, Mrs. Whitmore to the staff at Richard's law firm, and simply, my dear, to the man who had just introduced another woman as his soulmate in front of everyone we'd ever known. I had built my entire identity around being Richard's wife, the successful attorney's devoted partner, who had sacrificed her own career in journalism to support his rise to senior partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. The woman standing beside my husband possessed an ethereal beauty that made every other person in the room seem to fade into the background. Victoria appeared to be in her mid-30s, with platinum blonde hair that caught the chandelier light, like spun gold, and a figure that spoke of regular yoga classes and careful nutrition. She wore a stunning emerald green dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and diamond earrings that sparkled with an intensity that seemed almost mocking under the circumstances. But what struck me most wasn't her obvious beauty or her expensive attire. It was the way she looked at Richard with what appeared to be genuine affection, and more disturbing still, the way he looked back at her with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in decades. His eyes held a light, a vitality that made him appear years younger than his 75 years. When had I stopped inspiring that look in my husband? When had I become so invisible that he could fall in love with someone else without me even noticing? The country club's ballroom had been transformed into a golden wonderland for our celebration. 50 round tables draped in champagne-colored linens surrounded a dance floor where Richard and I were supposed to recreate our first dance as husband and wife. The DJ had been instructed to play The Way You Look Tonight, the same song that had played at our wedding reception in 1974. Now, as I stood there in my carefully chosen golden gown, a color meant to symbolize the precious nature of 50 years together, I felt like a fool dressed up for a party that was no longer mine. Our 3 children sat at the family table just 20 feet away, their faces reflecting the same shock and disbelief that rippled through the entire room. Jennifer, our eldest at 48, had driven in from Denver with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. Michael, 45, had flown in from Seattle with his partner David, and our youngest Sarah had taken time off from her medical residency in Boston to be here. All 3 of them looked as if they'd been physically struck, their mouths hanging open as they tried to process what their father had just announced to the world. Richard continued speaking into the microphone, his voice steady and confident, in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed this moment. I know this comes as a surprise to many of you, but Victoria has brought a joy and passion into my life that I didn't even know I was missing. At 75 years old, I've discovered what it means to feel truly alive again. The silence in the room was deafening. 200 people who had come to celebrate our golden anniversary now sat frozen in their chairs, unsure whether to applaud, leave, or simply pretend this wasn't happening. I could see my sister Helen at table 6, her face pale with fury as she gripped her husband's arm. My longtime friend Patricia from the garden club looked as if she might be sick, while my neighbor Mrs. Chen was openly staring with her mouth agape. I felt a strange detachment wash over me, as if I were watching this scene unfold from somewhere outside my own body. This couldn't be happening. Not at our golden anniversary. Not in front of our children, our grandchildren, our dearest friends. Not after 50 years of marriage, 50 years of building a life together, 50 years of what I had believed was love and partnership and mutual respect. But as I watched Richard's face, saw the genuine happiness radiating from his features, as he gazed at Victoria, I realized this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a cruel prank gone wrong. This was a man making a declaration, claiming his truth in the most public way possible. He wasn't asking for my forgiveness or my understanding. He wasn't even looking in my direction to gauge my reaction. He was simply announcing his new reality to the world and expecting everyone else to adjust accordingly. Victoria stepped closer to the microphone, her voice melodious and confident as she addressed the stunned crowd. I want everyone to know that Richard and I never intended for our love to hurt anyone. Sometimes the heart knows what it needs, even when the timing seems impossible. I hope that in time, you'll all understand that true love should be celebrated, not condemned. Her words hit me like physical blows. The casual way she spoke about their love, the assumption that everyone would eventually come around to accepting this betrayal, the complete disregard for my feelings or our marriage. It was breathtaking, in its audacity. Who was this woman who could stand in front of my family and friends and speak about stealing my husband as if it were some romantic fairy tale worthy of celebration? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony of the setting wasn't lost on me. The Ocean View Country Club had been where Richard proposed to me 51 years ago. I was 21 then, fresh out of Northwestern University with a journalism degree and dreams of becoming an investigative reporter. Richard was 24, just starting his career at Morrison. Blake and Associates, ambitious and charming and so confident in his vision of our future together. I remembered that proposal with painful clarity now. We'd been dining on the terrace overlooking Lake Michigan, the same terrace that was now decorated with golden lights for our anniversary celebration. He'd gotten down on one knee right as the sun was setting, presenting me with his grandmother's diamond ring and promising me a lifetime of love and adventure. Margaret Elizabeth Connors, he'd said, his voice shaking with emotion. Will you marry me and let me love you for the rest of my life? I'd said yes without hesitation, swept away by his passion and the promise of the life we would build together. 6 months later, we were married in Holy Name Cathedral, surrounded by 300 guests who celebrated our union with genuine joy and hope for our future. I'd worn my mother's wedding dress, carried peonies and roses, and felt like the luckiest woman in the world as I walked down the aisle toward the man I was certain would be my partner, through everything life could offer. Now, 5 decades later, that same man was using our golden anniversary party to introduce his mistress to our friends and family. The cruelty of it was staggering. Not only was he ending our marriage, but he was doing it in the most humiliating way possible, ensuring that every person who had witnessed our wedding would now witness its destruction. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made over the years. When Richard's career demanded long hours and frequent travel, I'd managed our household and raised our children virtually single-handedly. When his firm required him to entertain clients and attend social functions, I'd been the perfect wife, charming and gracious, and always supportive of his ambitions. When opportunities arose for me to return to journalism after the children were grown, I'd chosen instead to support Richard's bid for senior partner, believing that his success was our shared success. Had any of it mattered to him? Had he appreciated the career I'd given up, the dreams I'd set aside, The years I'd devoted to making his life easier and more successful? Looking at him now, basking in Victoria's adoring gaze, I wondered if he'd simply taken my devotion for granted while searching for something more exciting, more validating, more worthy of his attention. The practical implications of this moment began to crash over me like waves. Our beautiful home on Lakeshore Drive, filled with 50 years of memories and carefully collected antiques. Our shared bank accounts and investment portfolios, built through decades of careful planning and mutual sacrifice. Our social circle, which would now have to choose sides or find diplomatic ways to navigate this new reality. Our children, who would have to process the fact that their father had essentially abandoned their mother in the most public way possible. But beyond the practical concerns, there was a deeper devastation settling into my bones. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the obliteration of my entire understanding of my own life. If Richard could fall in love with someone else so completely that he'd announce it at our golden anniversary, what did that say about everything we'd shared together? Had our love been real? Or had I been living in a delusion for 50 years? Richard handed the microphone back to the DJ and began walking toward our table, Victoria's hand clasped firmly in his. The crowd remained frozen, unsure how to react to this unprecedented situation. I could hear whispered conversations starting at tables around the room, could see phones being discreetly pulled out as people undoubtedly began texting about what they'd just witnessed. As my husband approached, I found myself studying his face with new eyes. Richard had always been handsome in a distinguished way, with silver hair that had gone white in recent years and blue eyes that could be incredibly compelling when he focused his attention on someone. He'd maintained his figure through regular tennis games and had developed what people often called a distinguished bearing that served him well in the courtroom. But looking at him now, I saw something I'd missed before. There was a vitality in his expression, an energy that I realized had been absent when he looked at me for longer than I cared to acknowledge. When had we stopped truly seeing each other? When had our conversations become limited to logistics and social obligations? When had we become two people sharing a house and a history, but no longer sharing dreams or passion or even basic affection? "Maggie," Richard said as he reached our table, his voice carefully modulated in the tone he used for difficult conversations. "I know this is a shock, but I hoped we could discuss this like adults. Victoria and I have something special, something I never expected to find at this stage of my life." I stared at him, this man who had shared my bed for 50 years, who had fathered my children, who had been my companion through every major milestone of my adult life. How do you respond when someone casually destroys your entire world and then asks you to be reasonable about it? Discuss this like adults? I finally managed, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Richard, you just introduced your mistress to our children at our golden anniversary party. You humiliated me in front of everyone we've ever known. What exactly did you think we were going to discuss?" Victoria stepped forward, placing what I suppose she intended as a comforting hand on my arm. Her touch felt like ice against my skin. "Mrs. Whitmore, I know this is difficult, but Richard and I truly believe that honesty is the best foundation for moving forward. We didn't want to live a lie any longer." The audacity of this woman touching me, speaking to me as if we were friends working through a minor disagreement, sent a surge of rage through my system unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Who was she to lecture me about honesty when she'd been carrying on an affair with my husband? Who was she to act as if her comfort and Richard's happiness were the primary concerns in this situation? I stepped back from her touch, my voice gaining strength as anger began to override shock. "Don't you dare touch me. Don't you dare stand there and talk to me about honesty when you've been sneaking around with my husband behind my back? How long has this been going on? How long have you two been making a fool of me?" The questions tumbled out before I could stop them, each one feeling like a small reclamation of my power in this impossible situation. Around us, I could sense the other guests listening intently, though most were pretending to focus on their dinner plates or engage in quiet conversations with their table companions. Richard's jaw tightened, a familiar sign that he was preparing to assert control over a situation he found inconvenient. It was an expression I'd seen countless times over the years when he dealt with opposing counsel or difficult clients. Now, apparently, I had become another problem for him to manage. "Maggie, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, his attorney voice in full effect. "Victoria and I met at the museum fundraiser 8 months ago. What we have is real and meaningful, and I believe we all deserve to be happy." 8 months. 8 months of lies and deception while I'd been planning this anniversary celebration, while I'd been believing we were growing old together, while I'd been trusting that my marriage was secure even if it had become routine. 8 months of him coming home to me each night after spending time with her, of sharing meals and conversations and daily intimacies while his heart belonged to someone else. I thought about those 8 months, searching my memory for signs I should have noticed. Had he been different? More distracted? Had there been unexplained absences or changes in his routine that I'd dismissed as work-related stress? The humiliating truth was that I hadn't noticed anything significantly different. We'd continued our normal patterns: breakfast together, while reading separate sections of the newspaper, brief conversations about social obligations and household matters, polite goodnight kisses that had become more habit than affection. Our marriage had become so comfortable, so predictable, that Richard had apparently been able to conduct an entire love affair without me suspecting anything was amiss. What did that say about how disconnected we'd become? What did it say about how little attention I'd been paying to the man I'd shared my life with for half a century? But even as these self-doubts crept in, a fiercer emotion was building in my chest. Regardless of whatever problems our marriage might have had, regardless of whatever excitement or passion might have been missing from our relationship, Richard's solution had been to betray me in the most devastating way possible. He could have talked to me about his unhappiness. He could have suggested counseling or separation or any number of approaches that would have preserved some dignity for both of us. Instead, he'd chosen deception and public humiliation. He'd chosen to make our golden anniversary celebration into the stage for announcing his betrayal. He'd chosen to force our children and grandchildren to witness their family being destroyed in real time. These were choices he'd made deliberately, and they revealed something about his character that 50 years of marriage had apparently failed to teach me. Victoria was speaking again, her voice taking on a tone of patient explanation as if she were addressing a confused child. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is overwhelming, but Richard has been unhappy for years. He's told me how lonely he's been, how disconnected you two have become. Surely you must have felt it too." The presumption in her words was staggering. This woman, this stranger who had known my husband for 8 months, was lecturing me about the state of my own marriage. She was acting as if she understood Richard better than I did, as if her brief relationship gave her insights into a man I'd shared 5 decades with. But even as I prepared to respond with the full force of my anger, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that perhaps there was some truth in what she was saying. When was the last time Richard and I had truly talked about anything meaningful? When was the last time we'd laughed together or shared an intimate moment that wasn't just going through the motions? When was the last time I'd felt excited to see him walk through the door at the end of the day? These weren't questions I wanted to examine right now, not in front of this woman who had stolen my husband, not at what was supposed to be our celebration. But they lingered at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to complicate the clear narrative of betrayal and victimhood that seemed like the only way to make sense of this nightmare. Jennifer appeared at my side, her face flushed with anger and tears streaming down her cheeks. "Dad, how could you do this? How could you humiliate Mom like this? And in front of everyone we know?" Michael and Sarah had joined us now too, creating a family tableau that felt surreal under the circumstances. Here we were, the Whitmore family, having what was arguably the most important conversation of our collective lives in the middle of a party, while 200 people pretended not to listen to every word. Richard's expression softened slightly as he looked at his children, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "I know this is difficult to understand," he said, his voice taking on the gentle tone he'd used when they were young and needed comfort. "But children, even adult children, want their parents to be happy. Victoria makes me happy in a way I haven't felt in years." The simplicity of his statement was perhaps the most devastating part of this entire ordeal. He wasn't claiming that I'd been a terrible wife or that our marriage had been miserable. He was simply saying that someone else made him happier than I did, and apparently that was sufficient justification for destroying everything we'd built together. Sarah, always the most direct of our children, stepped forward with the prosecutorial skills she'd inherited from her father. "Dad, if you were so unhappy, why didn't you talk to Mom about it? Why didn't you try counseling or separation or any option that didn't involve lying and cheating and humiliating her like this?" Richard's jaw tightened again, and I could see him shifting into the defensive mode he adopted when his decisions were questioned. "Sarah, you're young and idealistic. Sometimes in long marriages, people grow apart. Sometimes what seems like the right thing to do in theory isn't practical in reality. Look, what's not practical about treating Mom with basic respect?" Michael interjected, his voice rising with emotion. "What's not practical about ending one relationship before starting another? What's not practical about not destroying your entire family for some midlife crisis?" Victoria placed a protective hand on Richard's arm, and I watched her face transform from patient understanding to defensive irritation. "Your father has spent decades being practical," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "He's spent his entire adult life being responsible and putting everyone else's needs first. Doesn't he deserve some happiness? Doesn't he deserve to feel alive and appreciated?" The implication was clear. I had failed to make Richard happy. I had failed to appreciate him. I had failed to make him feel alive. According to Victoria's narrative, I was the selfish one for expecting my husband to honor his marriage vows. I was the unreasonable one for not gracefully stepping aside so he could pursue his happiness with someone else. But as I stood there listening to this woman explain why my husband's betrayal was justified, something shifted inside me. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a clarity that was both terrifying and empowering. I was 72 years old, standing in a room full of people who had just witnessed my public humiliation, listening to my husband and his mistress explain why I should be understanding about their love affair. And for the first time in perhaps decades, I felt completely, utterly, and powerfully angry. The anger that had been building inside me suddenly crystallized into something far more powerful than emotion. It became purpose. As I stood there watching Richard and Victoria present their love affair as some kind of romantic destiny, I felt a transformation beginning that would have been impossible just minutes earlier. The woman who had spent 50 years being the perfect wife, the supportive partner, the accommodating mother, was dissolving away to reveal someone I'd forgotten existed. I looked around the ballroom one more time, taking in the faces of everyone, who had come to celebrate what they thought was a golden marriage. These weren't just guests at a party. They were witnesses to my humiliation, but they could also become witnesses to something else entirely. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to slink away in shame. I wasn't going to let Richard and Victoria control the narrative of this evening or my life. "Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the awkward murmurs of conversation around us. "Before you and Victoria continue with your announcements, I have something to share as well." The confidence in my tone surprised everyone, including myself. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, the way they did when he sensed an opponent in court was about to present unexpected evidence. Victoria's perfectly composed expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty I'd seen from her all evening. I walked to the microphone that Richard had abandoned, my golden gown rustling with each step. The room fell completely silent as 200 people turned their attention to me, the spurned wife who was either about to break down completely or do something unprecedented. I chose unprecedented. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady and clear as it projected through the sound system, "I want to thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate what we all believed was my golden wedding anniversary. As you've just learned, it appears that celebration was premature." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. I could see some people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, probably wishing they could disappear rather than witness this family drama. But others leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "However," I continued, "this evening has given me an unexpected gift. It's shown me that sometimes the most devastating moments of our lives can also be the most liberating. Tonight, I'm not just losing a husband, I'm rediscovering myself." I paused, looking directly at Richard and Victoria, who were standing frozen near our family table. "You see, while Richard was busy finding his real soulmate," I said, allowing just enough emphasis on the words to make my point clear, "I was busy remembering who I used to be before I became defined entirely by my role as his wife." The inspiration for what I was about to do had been building for months, though I hadn't recognized it at the time. 3 months ago, I'd received a phone call that had planted a seed I was only now ready to let bloom. It was from Marcus Chen, the editor-in-chief of the Chicago Tribune, offering me something I thought had passed me by forever. "Margaret Whitmore," he'd said during that surprising phone call, "I've been following the investigative pieces you've been writing for the neighborhood newsletter about the lakefront development corruption. Your work reminds me why you were one of the most promising journalism students I ever taught at Northwestern. I have a proposition for you." At the time, I'd dismissed his offer as flattery from an old professor trying to be kind to a former student. The investigative articles he mentioned had started as a hobby, a way to channel my frustration about the environmental destruction happening along our beloved lakefront. I'd never expected anyone in the professional journalism world to notice, let alone Marcus, who had become one of the most respected editors in Chicago. But his call had awakened something in me that I'd thought was long dead. For weeks afterward, I found myself thinking about the stories I wanted to tell, the corruption I wanted to expose, the voice I'd silenced for 5 decades in service of being the perfect attorney's wife. I'd started a private file on my computer, collecting notes and research on various investigations I'd like to pursue. It was purely hypothetical, of course, just the idle dreams of a woman whose real life was already fully defined. Now, standing at this microphone with my marriage in ruins around me, those hypothetical dreams suddenly became very real possibilities. Many of you know that I gave up my journalism career 50 years ago to support Richard's ambitions, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. It seemed like the right choice at the time, the expected choice for a young wife in 1974. But tonight has reminded me that we all have chances to reinvent ourselves, no matter how old we are or how set in our ways we think we've become. I could see confusion spreading across many faces in the audience. This wasn't the speech of a broken, humiliated woman they'd expected to witness. This was something else entirely, and they weren't sure how to react. "Richard, Victoria," I said, turning to address them directly, "I want to thank you for showing me that it's never too late to pursue your authentic self. Your courage in following your hearts, regardless of the consequences, has inspired me to find my own courage." Richard's face had gone pale. He knew me well enough to recognize when I was building towards something significant, and his legal instincts were clearly telling him that whatever I was about to say wasn't going to be favorable to his position. "Which is why," I continued, "I'm using this opportunity to make an announcement of my own. Next Monday morning, I'll be starting my new position as senior investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune, focusing on corruption in city government and corporate malfeasance. This? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in place as they processed what they'd just heard. I could see Marcus Chen at table 12, his face breaking into a smile of recognition and approval. He'd attended tonight because his wife was my friend Patricia, but now he was witnessing the birth of his newest employee in the most dramatic way possible. Furthermore, I said, my confidence building with each revelation, my first investigative series will examine the intersection of political influence and legal representation in Chicago, particularly focusing on how certain law firms leverage their connections to secure favorable outcomes for their corporate clients. Now Richard's face wasn't just pale, it was ashen. As senior partner at Morrison, Blake & Associates, he'd spent decades building relationships with judges, politicians, and corporate executives. The idea of his own wife investigating those relationships with her journalistic skills and insider knowledge was clearly terrifying him. Victoria stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. "You can't be serious. You're 72 years old. You can't just suddenly become a reporter because your husband found happiness with someone else." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt something fierce and joyful rise up in response. This young woman, who had clearly never faced any real obstacles in her privileged life, was telling me what I couldn't do based on my age. She was dismissing decades of experience, education, and capability, because she saw only an old woman who should gracefully accept her fate. "Victoria," I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I'd used in college when I'd been editor of the university newspaper, "you're right that I'm 72 years old, but what you clearly don't understand is that age brings certain advantages that youth lacks. I have nothing left to lose, no one left to please, and no reputation to protect except my own." I could feel the energy in the room shifting as my words sank in. Some of the guests were beginning to sit up straighter, particularly the women of my generation who had made similar sacrifices and similar compromises throughout their lives. I was saying things that many of them had probably thought but never dared to voice. "I also have 50 years of insider knowledge about how power operates in this city," I continued. "I've attended every political fundraiser, every judicial reception, every corporate gala. I've sat at dinner tables where deals were made, I've listened to conversations that were never meant to be recorded, and I've watched ethical lines being crossed so often that most people have forgotten where those lines were originally drawn." Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding tone. "Maggie, you can't be serious about this. You're talking about destroying people's careers, including mine. You're talking about burning down relationships I've spent decades building." His words revealed something important that I filed away for future consideration. Richard wasn't denying that there were questionable relationships and ethical gray areas in his professional life. He was simply arguing that I shouldn't expose them. The difference was significant and potentially very telling. "Richard," I replied, "I'm talking about holding people accountable for their actions. I'm talking about using my skills and knowledge to serve the public interest rather than private interests. Isn't that what journalism is supposed to do?" Jennifer had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, and now she stepped forward with tears in her eyes. But these weren't tears of sadness or shock. They were tears of pride and recognition. "Mom," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent ballroom, "I remember when I was little, you used to tell me stories about the articles you'd written in college, the investigations you'd done, the corruption you'd exposed. You always made it sound so exciting, so important. I used to wonder why you'd given all that up." Her words hit me like a physical force, reminding me of dreams I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten they existed. I remembered those conversations with my young daughter, remembered the way her eyes would light up when I told her about tracking down sources and uncovering truth, and making a difference in the world. I'd tried to make my sacrifice sound noble, but what I'd really been teaching her was that women's dreams were expendable. I gave it up because I thought supporting your father's career was more important than pursuing my own, I said, looking at all three of my children. I thought being a good wife meant making myself smaller so he could be bigger. But tonight has taught me that there's another way to be a good wife, a good mother, and a good person. By being true to yourself and using your gifts to make the world better. Michael stepped forward, his face reflecting a mixture of pride and concern. Mom, this is incredible, but are you sure you're ready for this kind of battle? Dad's firm has a lot of powerful allies. They won't just roll over and let you investigate them. His question was fair and important, and it deserved a thoughtful answer. Was I ready for the kind of professional and personal warfare that this decision would inevitably bring? Was I prepared to go head-to-head with some of the most powerful people in Chicago? Did I have the skills and stamina to compete in a field I'd left 50 years ago? Michael, I said, 3 months ago, I would have said no. I would have been terrified by the very idea. But tonight has clarified something important for me. I've spent 50 years being afraid of taking risks, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of failure. That fear has kept me safe, but it's also kept me small. I looked around the ballroom again, seeing it now not as the site of my humiliation, but as the launching pad for my liberation. I'm 72 years old, which means I probably have 15 or 20 good years left. I can spend those years being bitter about what I've lost, or I can spend them building something meaningful with what I've gained. Sarah, always the pragmatist, raised a concern that had probably occurred to several people in the room. Mom, what about the practical issues? Where will you live? How will you support yourself? What about insurance and retirement planning? These were legitimate questions that I'd been thinking about ever since Marcus's phone call 3 months ago. The offer from the Tribune included a substantial salary, full benefits, and the kind of respect and professional recognition I'd never experienced in my role as Richard's wife. Sarah, I said, your father and I will need to discuss the practical arrangements, but I want everyone here to understand something important. I'm not doing this out of spite or revenge. I'm doing this because for the first time in 50 years, I have the opportunity to use my education, my experience, and my skills to do something that matters. Victoria, who had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange, finally exploded with the kind of emotional outburst that revealed her true character. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, loud enough for everyone in the ballroom to hear clearly. "You're not some investigative reporter. You're a bitter old woman who can't accept that your husband has found real love. You're trying to destroy him because you can't stand that he chose someone better." The silence that followed her outburst was different from the previous silences. This one was charged with shock and disapproval. Even people who might have been sympathetic to Victoria's position were clearly appalled by her lack of grace and respect. She'd just revealed herself to be exactly what many people had suspected. A selfish young woman with no understanding of loyalty, sacrifice, or basic human decency. But her words also did something she hadn't intended. They freed me from any lingering doubt about the path I was choosing. If this was the kind of person Richard preferred over me, if this was the level of character he found more appealing than 50 years of devotion and partnership, then I truly had nothing left to lose. "Victoria," I said, my voice calm and steady, "you're right about one thing. I am old, at least compared to you. But what you clearly don't understand is that age gives you perspective that youth simply cannot provide. I've seen enough of life to know the difference between love and infatuation, between character and charm, between substance and surface." I paused, letting my words sink in before continuing. "I've also learned that the most dangerous person in any room is someone who has nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. Richard may prefer your youth and beauty, But I suspect that Chicago's corrupt politicians and unethical businessmen are going to find my age and experience far more concerning. The applause started slowly, with just one person clapping, Marcus Chen, who stood up at his table and began applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Then Patricia joined him, followed by my sister Helen, and then wave after wave of people throughout the ballroom began standing and applauding. It wasn't universal. Some people remained seated, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation or loyal to Richard, but enough people were applauding that the sound filled the room with an energy that felt like validation and support and encouragement all rolled together. As the applause continued, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The fear that had governed my life for 50 years was gone, replaced by excitement about the future and confidence in my ability to shape it. Richard stood there watching this display of support for my announcement, his face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and what might have been recognition that he'd made a terrible miscalculation. He'd clearly expected me to be devastated by his announcement, to retreat in shame and hurt. Instead, he'd inadvertently freed me to become someone more powerful and authentic than I'd ever been during our marriage. When the applause finally died down, I returned to the microphone for one final statement. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your support. This has been an evening none of us expected, but it's also been an evening that's reminded me of something important. It's never too late to start over, to pursue your dreams, to refuse to be defined by other people's limitations or expectations. I looked directly at the younger women in the audience, including my own daughters and granddaughters. I want every woman here to remember that your dreams don't have expiration dates. Your talents don't become invalid when you reach a certain age or marital status. Your voice doesn't become less important because someone else has decided they prefer a different voice. The response to these words was even more enthusiastic than the previous applause, and I could see women throughout the room wiping away tears and nodding with recognition and determination. As I stepped away from the microphone, I felt Richard approaching from behind. When I turned to face him, I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. He was looking at me with genuine respect, perhaps even admiration, for just a moment. I caught a glimpse of the young man who had fallen in love with an ambitious journalism student 51 years ago. "Maggie," he said quietly, "I never meant for any of this to hurt you so badly." It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said all evening, and it deserved an honest response. "Richard," I replied, "I know you didn't intend to hurt me, but you also didn't intend to consider me at all. For 8 months, you made decisions about our future without including me in the conversation. Tonight, I'm finally making decisions about my future without including you." He nodded slowly, seeming to understand that something fundamental had shifted between us that couldn't be undone by apologies or explanations. "What happens now?" he asked. I smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in longer than I could remember. "Now, Richard, we both find out what it's like to be our authentic selves. You found yours with Victoria. And I said, looking around the ballroom that had been transformed from the site of my humiliation into the birthplace of my liberation, "I'm about to rediscover mine." 3 weeks after the Golden Anniversary disaster, I sat in my new corner, office at the Chicago Tribune, surrounded by boxes of files, newspaper clippings, and legal documents that represented the beginning of the most ambitious investigation of my career. The irony wasn't lost on me that at 72 years old, I was finally living the dream I'd abandoned at 22. But what I hadn't expected was how the dream had evolved, become richer and more complex through decades of life experience I couldn't have possessed as a young woman. Marcus Chen knocked on my open door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of an editor who had just discovered something significant. "Margaret, I think you need to see what our research team found when they started following." up on your initial leads about Morrison, Blake, and Associates. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of revelation and transformation. Moving out of the Lakeshore Drive house had been emotionally challenging, but practically liberating. I'd rented a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, walking distance from the Tribune offices, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the lake. For the first time in 50 years, I was living in a space that reflected my tastes, my needs, my vision of comfort and functionality. Richard had been surprisingly cooperative about the separation logistics, perhaps because he understood that my new career gave me the power to make his life very difficult if he chose to be vindictive. Victoria, on the other hand, had apparently been pressuring him to fight me on everything from property division to spousal support. According to Jennifer, who maintained relationships with both her parents despite her fury about the situation, Victoria couldn't understand why Richard was letting me have so much when I was obviously just being spiteful. But spite had nothing to do with what I was discovering in my investigation. If anything, I was learning that my marriage had been even more complicated than I'd realized, in ways that had nothing to do with Richard's affair and everything to do with the systematic corruption that had shaped his entire career. Marcus set down the coffee and opened a thick file folder on my desk. Your instincts about the judicial connections were absolutely correct, but this goes deeper than we initially thought. Your husband's firm hasn't just been influencing legal outcomes. They've been essentially operating as a shadow government for some of Chicago's most problematic development projects. The documents he showed me painted a picture of corruption that was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Morrison, Blake, and Associates had spent decades building a network of relationships that allowed their corporate clients to circumvent environmental regulations, zoning restrictions, and public oversight processes. The lakefront development project I'd been writing about for the neighborhood newsletter was just the tip of an iceberg that included illegal demolitions, fraudulent environmental impact studies, and bribery schemes that reached into the highest levels of city government. Margaret, Marcus said, his voice carrying the excitement that comes with uncovering a major story. This could be the kind of investigation that changes how business gets done in this city. But I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared for how personal this is going to become? Your husband is named in at least a dozen of these documents. I studied the papers spread across my desk, seeing Richard's signature on legal briefs that I now understood had been designed to circumvent laws protecting the public interest. These weren't technicalities or gray areas. These were deliberate attempts to help wealthy clients avoid accountability for environmental destruction and community displacement. Marcus, I said, feeling a clarity that surprised me with its intensity. 3 weeks ago, I thought the worst thing about my marriage was that my husband had fallen in love with someone else. Now I'm learning that the man I shared my life with has spent decades helping destroy the communities and environments that I care most about. Personal doesn't begin to describe how this feels. But even as I said those words, I realized something important. The pain of learning about Richard's professional corruption felt different from the pain of learning about his affair. The affair had made me feel personally rejected and inadequate. The corruption made me feel angry and determined to seek justice. The difference was significant, and it was teaching me something valuable about where I found my sense of purpose and identity. My phone rang, interrupting my conversation with Marcus. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar and unexpected. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Detective Rosa Martinez with the Chicago Police Department's White-Collar Crime Unit. I understand you're investigating Morrison, Blake and Associates for the Tribune. I was wondering if we could meet. I have information that might be relevant to your work. The call was both thrilling and terrifying. If the police were already investigating Richard's firm, it meant the corruption was even more serious than I'd realized. It also meant that my investigation could potentially contribute to criminal prosecutions, not just newspaper exposés. Detective Martinez, I said, I'd be very interested in meeting with you. When and where would be convenient? An hour later, I sat across from Detective Martinez in a coffee shop near police headquarters, listening to her explain how my neighborhood newsletter articles about the lakefront development had caught the attention of law enforcement officials, who had been building a case against several construction companies and their legal representatives. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "your articles demonstrated an understanding of the environmental and legal issues that impressed a lot of people. When we learned that you were married to Richard Whitmore and were now working for the Tribune, we realized you might be in a unique position to help us understand how these schemes operate." Detective Martinez was in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence and careful attention to detail that reminded me of my younger self. As she explained the scope of the police investigation, I found myself thinking about the paths that had led us both to this moment. She had spent her career building expertise in financial crimes and corruption cases. I had spent mine as an observer of the very network she was now trying to dismantle. "What exactly would you need from me?" I asked, though I was already beginning to understand the extraordinary opportunity this represented. "We need someone who understands how these relationships work from the inside," she explained. "Someone who's attended the parties, heard the conversations, seen the informal deals being made. We have financial records and legal documents, but we need help understanding the human element, who talks to whom, how influence gets exercised, where the real power lies." As Detective Martinez outlined what police had already discovered, I realized that my 50 years as Richard's wife had given me access to information that no outside investigator could have obtained. I'd attended hundreds of social events where business was conducted informally. I'd hosted dinner parties where judges, politicians, and corporate executives had spoken freely because they assumed everyone present shared their interests. I'd listened to phone conversations and dinner table discussions that revealed the real mechanisms of power in Chicago. More importantly, I understood something that younger investigators might miss: how these relationships had evolved over decades, how trust was built and maintained, how favors were exchanged and debts accumulated. I could provide context that would help law enforcement understand not just what had happened, but how and why it had been possible. "Detective Martinez," I said, "I'm willing to cooperate fully with your investigation, but I need you to understand something. This isn't just about my husband's firm. What you're describing is a system that's affected every major development project in Chicago for the past 30 years. If we're going to do this, we need to be prepared to follow the evidence wherever it leads." Her smile told me that was exactly what she'd hoped to hear. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think you're going to discover that this investigation is bigger than either of us imagined when we started." Over the following weeks, I found myself living a double life that was both exhilarating and exhausting. During the day, I worked at the Tribune, writing articles and conducting interviews for what was becoming a major investigative series. In the evenings, I met with Detective Martinez and her team, providing background information and helping them understand the social dynamics that had enabled decades of corruption. She was supposed to be a distraction, a way to maintain access to high-stakes games. But somewhere along the way, the fantasy of starting over with someone who didn't know about my problems became more appealing than facing the reality of what I'd become. The complexity of what Richard was revealing forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about our relationship and his behavior. The man I'd been married to for 50 years hadn't simply chosen to become corrupt. He'd been trapped in a cycle of addiction that had gradually destroyed his judgment, his ethics, and his ability to maintain authentic relationships. "Richard," I said, "why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you ask for help years ago?" His answer revealed the final piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. "Because I was afraid that if you knew the truth about what I'd become, you'd leave me." Ironically, by trying to protect our marriage from the truth, I ended up destroying it anyway. But Richard had more to tell me, and what came next would transform not just my understanding of our relationship, but my entire investigation into the corruption that had shaped both our lives. Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second folder, this one containing documents that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about the investigation I'd been conducting. As he opened it, I could see financial records, correspondence, and what appeared to be detailed notes written in his careful handwriting. "Maggie," he said, his voice steady, but filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "For the past 18 months, I've been working with the FBI as an informant. Everything you've been investigating, every corrupt practice you've uncovered, I've been helping federal agents document it all." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the documents spread across the table, trying to process what Richard was telling me. The man I'd been investigating as a criminal was actually an undercover cooperator working to expose the very crimes I'd been attributing to him. "The gambling addiction was real," he continued, "and it did drive me to make some terrible decisions early on. But 2 years ago, when the debts became impossible to hide and I realized I was facing criminal charges, federal agents approached me with an opportunity to make things right. They offered me a chance to help expose the systematic corruption that goes far beyond Morrison, Blake, and Associates." Richard showed me documents that revealed the true scope of what I'd stumbled into with my investigation. The corruption I'd been uncovering wasn't limited to one law firm or even one city. It was part of a nationwide network of developers, attorneys, and political figures who had been systematically exploiting environmental and zoning laws for decades. The FBI needed someone with inside access to document how these schemes operate, Richard explained. Someone who could attend the meetings, record the conversations, and provide evidence that would stand up in federal court. They needed someone the other participants trusted completely. As I absorbed this information, I began to understand the extraordinary personal cost of what Richard had been doing. For 18 months, he'd been living a triple life, maintaining his role as a respected attorney, secretly documenting crimes being committed by his partners and clients, all while struggling with addiction and the guilt of having initially participated in the corruption he was now helping to expose. "The offshore accounts you discovered," he said, "those were set up by the FBI to track money laundering operations. The questionable legal briefs with my signature, I was required to participate in those cases to maintain my cover while gathering evidence about how the fraudulent environmental reports were being produced." I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake wondering how the man I'd married could have become someone capable of the corruption I was investigating. Now I was learning that he'd actually been risking his life to expose it. "Richard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe you were part of the problem when you were actually part of the solution?" His answer revealed the depth of the sacrifice he'd been making. "Because the FBI made it clear that the operation would only work if my cover was absolutely complete. No one could know, not even you. Especially not you, because your reaction to my behavior had to be genuine. If you'd known I was working undercover, you might have acted differently, and that could have compromised the entire investigation." The irony was staggering. My marriage had been destroyed not by Richard's corruption, but by his commitment to justice. His affair with Victoria, his distant behavior, his secretive activities, all of it had been designed to create a believable cover story for an undercover operation that was aimed at protecting the very communities I'd been trying to help with my journalism. "But Richard," I said, "the affair with Victoria was real. You introduced her as your soulmate at our anniversary party. That wasn't part of some FBI operation." Richard's face crumpled with genuine shame and regret. "You're right. The relationship with Victoria started as part of my cover. She was connected to some of the criminal enterprises we were investigating. But somewhere along the way, the line between performance and reality became blurred. I was so deep in this double life, so isolated from everyone I really cared about, that I convinced myself the fantasy was better than the truth." He pulled out another document, This one showing that his relationship with Victoria had actually compromised the FBI operation. When I introduced her at our anniversary party, I wasn't just humiliating you. I was potentially exposing an ongoing federal investigation. The FBI was furious. They pulled me from active participation that same week. As Richard continued explaining the complexities of his situation, I began to understand that we'd both been casualties of a justice system that sometimes requires good people to make impossible choices. He'd been forced to sacrifice his marriage and his personal integrity to expose crimes that were harming communities like Elena's. I'd been forced to believe my husband was a criminal in order to develop the anger and determination necessary to pursue my own investigation. The most painful part, Richard said, was watching you become the journalist you'd always been meant to be, knowing that your investigation was helping the same cause I'd been secretly serving, but being unable to tell you we were on the same side. I thought about all the sleepless nights I'd spent feeling betrayed and abandoned, all the rage that had fueled my transformation from housewife to investigative reporter. All the personal growth that had emerged from what I'd believed was the worst betrayal of my life. Had any of it been real if the foundation of my anger had been based on a misunderstanding? Richard, I said, I need to understand something. Are you telling me that our marriage ended because you were trying to serve justice? That I spent 2 months hating you for crimes you were actually trying to expose? His answer was both simpler and more complex than I'd expected. Our marriage ended because I made a series of choices that prioritized abstract justice over personal relationships. I chose to participate in an operation that required me to lie to you every day for 18 months. I chose to develop a relationship with another woman as part of that operation, and ultimately, I chose to believe that the end justified the means, even when those means included destroying everything I'd claimed to value most. The weight of what Richard was telling me forced me to reconsider not just our relationship, but my entire understanding of morality, justice, and personal responsibility. Was he a hero who had sacrificed his marriage to expose corruption? Was he a fool who had destroyed his family for the abstract principle of law enforcement? Or was he simply a flawed human being who had made impossible choices in an impossible situation? There's something else you need to know, Richard continued, pulling out a final set of documents. The FBI operation is ending next week. There will be arrests, probably including some of my former partners at Morrison, Blake & Associates. But there will also be testimony from informants, including me. The trials that follow are going to expose everything we've both been investigating, but they're also going to reveal my role in the operation. I stared at the federal arrest warrants bearing dates from the following week. Names I recognized from Chicago's business and political elite were listed as defendants in charges ranging from money laundering to environmental fraud to racketeering. It was the culmination of everything I'd been working toward with my journalism, but it was also the vindication of Richard's claims about his own role in exposing the corruption. Maggie, Richard said, I need you to know that when this goes public, people are going to understand that you weren't just investigating random corruption. You were investigating the same criminal enterprise that I'd been working to expose from the inside. Your articles, your sources, your evidence, all of it helped build the case that's going to put these people in prison. The realization that my journalism had been contributing to a federal investigation filled me with a pride unlike anything I'd ever experienced. But it also raised questions about the path forward that I wasn't sure how to answer. What happens now? I asked. What happens to us? Richard's answer revealed how much he'd changed through this ordeal. That's entirely up to you, Maggie. I've learned that trying to control outcomes, trying to manipulate situations for what I thought was the greater good, only leads to more pain and more complications. I can tell you what I hope will happen, but I can't tell you what should happen. Over the next hour, Richard outlined what the coming months would look like. The federal trials would require testimony from both of us, him as an informant who had documented the crimes from the inside, me as a journalist who had independently verified many of the same facts. The publicity would be intense, potentially, lasting for years as the various cases worked their way through the court system. More personally, Richard had entered a treatment program for gambling addiction and was working with therapists to understand how his choices had affected our family. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. He was simply trying to become someone worthy of whatever relationship, if any, we might be able to build in the future. "I know I destroyed our marriage," he said as our conversation wound down. "I know I hurt you in ways that can't be undone. But I also know that what you've accomplished over the past 2 months, the journalism, the investigation, the way you've rebuilt your life, that's not something that happened because of my betrayal. That's something that happened because of who you've always been, even when circumstances didn't allow you to express it." As I drove home that evening, I found myself thinking about the complexity of truth and the impossibility of understanding anyone's story completely. Richard had betrayed our marriage, but he'd done it while serving a cause that aligned with my own values. He'd lied to me for 18 months, but those lies had been in service of exposing larger lies that were harming entire communities. He'd developed genuine feelings for another woman, but that relationship had emerged from the isolation and moral complexity of an undercover operation that required him to sacrifice his authentic self. None of this excused his choices or erased the pain they'd caused. But it did force me to acknowledge that the story I'd been telling myself about our marriage, the narrative of betrayal and abandonment that had fueled my transformation, was only part of a much more complicated truth. The next morning, I sat in my Tribune office writing what would become the most challenging article of my career. It was the story of a marriage that had been destroyed by the pursuit of justice, of 2 people who had unknowingly been working toward the same goal while believing they were adversaries, of the personal cost that sometimes comes with doing the right thing. But as I wrote, I realized that the most important part of the story wasn't about Richard's undercover work or the federal investigation, or even the corruption we'd both been fighting. It was about the discovery that transformation can emerge from any circumstance, no matter how painful or confusing. Marcus Chen read my article in silence, his expression cycling through surprise, concern, and something that might have been admiration. When he finished, he looked up at me with the kind of respect that comes from recognizing someone has done something genuinely difficult. "Margaret," he said, "this is extraordinary journalism. But more than that, it's extraordinary humanity. You've written about your own life with the same objectivity and integrity you've brought to investigating corruption. That takes a kind of courage I've rarely seen." The article was published the following Sunday, just 3 days before the federal arrests were scheduled to begin. The response was immediate and overwhelming, from readers who identified with the complexity of long-term relationships, from other women who had discovered their own strength through crisis, from journalists who appreciated the ethical challenges of reporting on personal circumstances. But the most meaningful response came from Elena Rodriguez, the community organizer whose story had helped focus my investigation on the human impact of corruption. She called me the day after the article was published, her voice filled with gratitude and something deeper. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "your article helped me understand something important about my own life. I've been so focused on fighting the people who were trying to destroy our community that I never stopped to think about why they might have made the choices they made. I'm not saying I forgive them. What they did was wrong regardless of their motivations. But understanding the complexity helps me figure out how to prevent it from happening again." Elena's words helped me articulate something I'd been struggling to understand about my own experience. The point of seeking truth, whether through journalism or personal relationships, isn't to find simple answers or clear villains. It's to understand situations completely enough to make better choices going forward. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse watching Richard testify against his former partners, his voice steady as he detailed the crimes he'd helped document over 18 months of undercover work. The defense attorneys tried to discredit him as a gambling addict who had betrayed his clients to save himself. But the evidence he'd gathered was overwhelming, and his testimony was corroborated by documentation that left no room for doubt. In the gallery, I sat next to Elena Rodriguez and dozens of other community members whose lives had been affected by the corruption Richard had helped expose. Some of them knew about our personal connection. Others simply recognized me as the Tribune reporter who had helped bring national attention to their struggles. As I listened to Richard's testimony, I found myself thinking about the different kinds of courage that had brought us all to this moment. There was Richard's courage in agreeing to work undercover despite the personal risk. There was Elena's courage in fighting for her community, despite overwhelming odds. There was my own courage in rebuilding my life after everything I'd believed about it proved to be incomplete. But perhaps the most important courage was the kind we were all demonstrating by being willing to acknowledge that truth is more complex than any single perspective can capture, that justice sometimes requires impossible choices, and that healing begins with understanding rather than condemnation. After Richard finished his testimony, he approached me in the courthouse corridor. We'd been communicating sporadically over the months, maintaining the kind of careful distance that allowed us both to process everything that had happened without the pressure of immediate decisions about the future. "Maggie," he said, "I know this is presumptuous, but I wondered if you might be willing to have dinner with me sometime. Not as an attempt to resurrect our marriage, but as two people who've been through something extraordinary together and might benefit from talking about it." I looked at this man who had been my husband for 50 years, who had betrayed me and protected me simultaneously, who had destroyed our marriage in service of principles I shared. He looked older, more worn by the experience, but also somehow more authentic than he'd been in years. "Richard," I said, "I think that might be possible. But not yet. I need more time to understand who I am in this new life before I can figure out what role, if any, you might have in it." He nodded, understanding that this wasn't a rejection but simply an acknowledgement that some transformations take time to complete. "I'll wait," he said. "However long it takes, I'll wait." As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that night at our anniversary party. Complete honesty about my own feelings and complete freedom to choose my own path forward. The investigation was over. The criminals were being held accountable, and the communities that had been harmed were beginning to heal. But more importantly, I had discovered something about myself that no external circumstance could ever take away. The knowledge that I was capable of transforming any situation, no matter how painful or confusing, into an opportunity for growth and service to others. 1 year later, I stood at the podium of the Chicago Press Club, accepting the award for investigative journalism that my series on municipal corruption had earned. In the audience sat my children, my colleagues from the Tribune, Detective Martinez and her team, Elena Rodriguez, and dozens of community activists whose work had inspired my reporting. And in the back row, almost hidden behind a pillar, sat Richard. We'd been having those careful dinners for several months, slowly rebuilding trust and understanding. We hadn't made any decisions about the future of our relationship, but we'd made peace with the past and with each other. As I looked out at the audience, I realized that the story that had begun with what seemed like the worst betrayal of my life had actually been the beginning of the most authentic period I'd ever experienced. The pain had been real. The confusion had been overwhelming. But the growth that had emerged from both had given me a life richer and more meaningful than anything I'd previously imagined possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said into the microphone, "this award represents more than recognition for a single investigation. It represents the power of truth to transform not just communities and institutions, but the people who seek it. Sometimes, The most devastating moments of our lives turn out to be the exact experiences we needed to become who we were always meant to be. The applause that followed felt like validation, not just of my work, but of the choice to see crisis as opportunity, betrayal as invitation to growth, and endings as the beginning of stories we couldn't have written any other way. At 73 years old, I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. It's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be, no matter how unlikely the circumstances that force you to discover her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from
us.